Hello and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. And today with me we have John Grant Ross. He is a New Zealand writer based in Taiwan. He spent 3 decades in Asia, starting as a failed freelance photojournalist, then becoming an English teacher and author. His works include Formosa Odyssey, Taiwan Past and Present, Taiwan in 100 Books, and You Don't Know China, 22 Enduring Myths Debunked. So, welcome, John.
Hi, Amy. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
I have been looking so forward to this podcast. And of course, it's been in the making for 6 months now, just trying to get a time that we could both do it. So I'm so happy to finally be able to talk to you.
Thank you very much.
And I'm in the middle of, I haven't quite finished it yet, but I'm in the middle of reading your Formosa Odyssey. I believe you had just arrived in Taiwan. How much later, after you'd arrived, had you gone on this trip, which is through Taiwan, where you explain the history and some of the sites and stuff in the country? And at the beginning of the book, you say that you kind of went on a whim, but could you let us know a little bit more about what made you decide to go to Taiwan, and how long had you been there when you started writing the book?
Like many people who come to Taiwan, I didn't really have a long-standing plan to come here. It was that old problem of needing money and English teaching being a good option. I first came here to teach English in 1994. The idea had come to me when I'd been gold prospecting up in the mountains of New Zealand's South Island. Some barely remembered conversations from travelers I'd come across in Thailand. Yes, it seemed like easier money than gold prospecting. I came to Taiwan because I thought it was a good location to make money and also to finish a book I was doing on the ethnic insurgency in Burma. I wanted to wrap that up, and also to work on my next big project in the search of the Mongolian man-beast, the Mongolian Yeti.
Ooh.
I was to work here in Taiwan, and then in the summer, head over to Mongolia. In the summers, I would need multiple trips. Which I did. Lived in Mongolia for a while, but it's a book that hasn't been completed yet, and as yet, no Mongolian Yeti discovered.
Oh, it sounds so fantastic, though, even if you don't discover it. I mean, imagine, he could be just created in all the minds of the people, right? Wouldn't that be good enough?
Yes, that's right. It was a frame for a travel book, a travelogue. What desperate times for us writers when we need such flimsy frameworks. But if my modern self travels back in time to young John, it's like, hey, you really believe that, don't you? Well, I have to believe it to go trekking through the mountains, don't you? So, yes. So I came to Taiwan, and I did go to Burma and finished that book, written under a different name, because it has lots of illegal entries into the country and traveling with insurgents deep behind enemy lines. I went to Mongolia, lived there, came back to Taiwan, and I just found that Taiwan was a fascinating place. So after 4 years here, I thought, wow, I'm going to do a epic travelogue, walk the length of the country along the mountainous spine and the foothills. I mean, we have magnificent mountains here, the highest peak in East Asia. Sorry to Mount Fuji, but we just beat that by a little bit. It's not something you immediately think of when you think of Taiwan, forests and mountains. So I planned a 2-month trip along the spine of Taiwan. And the very day, the morning that I was going to leave, there was a massive earthquake. September 21st, 1999. Over 2,300 people died. And the country was devastated. And
it wasn't the safest time to go hiking on a mountain either, with all the aftershocks.
Right. Well, the trails were wiped out. The roads were wiped out. Yes. Well, I can't complain about my small personal loss of having to change the theme of the book. But yeah, that's what I did. So I moved away from it being a travelogue to a combination of some travel, history, and some small town life.
I see. Well, it works very well. I'm definitely enjoying it. You've taken buses, you've walked, you've, talked to people, and maybe some flashbacks, to some conversations you've had with people. It's a nice mix.
So, Amy, I was trying to think of some Taiwan-Japan connections. I'm in a very small town, but we lay claim to being the birthplace of the inventor of instant noodles.
Really? Taiwan?
Yeah. What's the guy's name? Let me think. Momofuku Ando.
Oh,
Born here.
Momofuku. Yeah, Momofuku. He's from Taiwan.
Yeah, born here. But when he invented the noodles, he was back in Japan. He's ethnic Japanese. I'm in a very small place, so you have to take what you can get.
Absolutely, and that's a good one. Was he born in Taiwan because he was born at the time that it was occupied?
That's right. So Japan ran Taiwan from 1895 to the end of the war, 1945. And Taiwan really stands out from the rest of Southeast Asia. Asia has quite fond memories of Japanese rule, or mixed. There was some economic exploitation and harsh rule, but it was pretty good. A lot of development, and what followed afterwards was probably worse, at least in the beginning.
If we can explain to our audience what the development and such, and Taiwan is, a bit of a shining jewel for Japan and its occupation of various different places. It didn't go nearly as well in other places such as Indonesia and Korea and such. But how did Japan change Taiwan in, some of the areas for the better, perhaps, such as education or?
Well, that's one. Modern education, better health. They did a lot of irrigation. So they developed agriculture, transportation. Didn't start the railway network, but they really built it up and completed it. Just sort of all your goodies from modernization. It's the Japanese that brought those in. Not much in the way of self-rule, or the Taiwanese being allowed to get to the top, but just in terms of general infrastructure and development, not bad.
Yes, and it's hard to talk about Taiwan without talking about Japan, because they did, rule at a key time period for 50 years. So, and one of the things I like about your podcast, because you also are a podcaster, and the podcast is called Formosa Files, and it's about the history of Taiwan. But you do have lots of episodes that concern Japan. So I always make sure that I listen to those. But the influence, yes, is, far-reaching. And I know we went to Taiwan, I guess it's been 7 years ago now, sailed around the whole country and spent a month all together in different ports and going into different cities and such. And the reception was great. And there seemed to be no friction at all with Japan and Taiwan at that time. And I think also the good thing about Taiwan is they move on.
Yes.
So that makes a big difference too. It's like sometimes we just have to look forward and say, okay, these things happen. Some were good, some were bad, and let's just move forward and make it better.
And Taiwan has a lot of practice at being ruled by foreign powers. We've had the Dutch back in the 1600s, and the Spanish, they came here too at that time, up in the north. The French even attacked us, occupied a port for a while. The Americans, they contemplated having a port here, force as well. Before them, the Ming loyalists who were escaping the advancing Manchus. Yeah, so lots of different rulers. And being an island and being involved in trade, it's a more open-minded country than what you might expect,
So Taiwan in 100 Books, which I really, really love that book, because in it you mention all these other books that people could read to find out different things about Taiwan. Mm-hmm. And also, it's a good look at modern literature as well. As the same perhaps with Japan, usually the first people to infiltrate, the very first foreigners to infiltrate are missionaries or traders. But missionaries seem to make a big splash. And so there's quite a lot of literature out there written by missionaries from earlier times. And so you go through quite a few of those. And I probably read 7 books just that had been recommended in your Taiwan in 100 Books. And it was fascinating. I really loved it because I I prefer recommendations for books than, trying to figure out if the book is good via a review or, a podcast or such. I take people who I admire, and I take their recommendations seriously. And I find that's the best way to find other books, word of mouth.
Well, thank you. Yes. Some of the books that made it into Taiwan in 100 books were there because they were a good match for the particular story I was telling. They're not necessarily the best, but
right.
Yes.
Well, also Taiwan in 100 books is a bit different than writing a book like, China in 100 books. I imagine there's not quite as much literature out there, but it still, would have been quite an ordeal to narrow it down to 100 books. And you must have read everything on Taiwan.
Well, you mentioned easier than China in 100 books. So that's actually the first in 100 books title I started working on.
Oh, really?
That's where the idea comes from, because the great challenge when you want to read about China is knowing which books you should read or which books have been important. And then somehow I ended up writing the Taiwan one first. You know how these things go.
Indeed. So we can expect one on China from you then.
Yes, that's right. I should explain to listeners, 100 books, it's not just a summary or an opinion about one book and then move on to the next. It's telling the story of a country through books.
And that you weaved through very well. I thought that you're a very good storyteller. So Taiwan in 100 books, it's a great story weaved in with books. And so any lover of literature and history and Taiwan is really going to love it. It really, hits many chords with different readers, I'm sure.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's fun. It's tremendous fun. And, the backstories to the books, manuscripts lying neglected or lost for years, and people afraid to publish books. Of course, I kick off the book with this magnificent fraud from 1704, Salmanazar, a Frenchman pretending to be a Formosan native and publishing a book about Taiwan.
That is one of the best beginnings of a book I've ever read. That was fantastic. I was just like, wow, someone could pull that off too at that time.
Yeah, I love that. It's just funny. It's a great story by itself. But, behind that, there are some still very relevant takeaways that his story was believed because people wanted to believe it. As I go into the sources that were available, people did know about Formosa, Taiwan, if they wanted to know about it. But because his book, a description of Formosa, an island subject to the Emperor of Japan, because so much of the book was trashing Catholics, Jesuits, defending the Church of England, then people joined on and backed him. Mm-hmm. And you can see it today, disinformation and polarization. Yeah, it's still very relevant.
And I don't think it was that unusual for the times either. A lot of these older, books on Japan also are quite controversial. And so I think that a lot of people were, they were out, they were traveling, they were seeing exotic places. And, you bring up subjects such as headhunters and such. And it must be difficult not to go and just write in a bit of a sensationalist form, because you've already captured the people's imagination at that point, right? Then you just have to run with it. I mean, they do that with movies too, don't they? So yeah, it's not just limited to books. But there was a time when people were just so eager to read things. It was almost like nonfiction was fiction, right?
Well, actually, there's a trend now with books being memoirs, but fictionalized. Just right. From the legal point of view, it's safer.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I prefer just straight memoirs, but yeah, I'm afraid that has crept into, because of, like you said, of the legal ramifications. Now, speaking of fictions, I want to touch on your book, You Don't Know China, which is about 22 fictions, myths, that you bust about China. So can you give our listeners a couple examples of the things you cover in there? That's kind of a fun book as well.
I get into topics like opium not being as bad as it was painted to be, not such a curse for China. That's quite controversial. I look into Chinese medicine and acupuncture. And for example, with acupuncture, just say how recent that really is. There are some fun ones about fortune cookies, eating dogs. Yes. So those things are easily dismissed. But I think the more interesting things with the Great Wall are that it's not 2,000 years old. Most of what we think of as the Great Wall was built during the late days of the Ming, so 1600s. And yeah, it's not one wall. It's multiple walls over time. And during long periods, long centuries, the walls were neglected and people didn't really notice them. Probably my favorite chapter in that book is on the Macartney mission to China, 1793. He meets the Qianlong Emperor, one of the greatest emperors in China's history. And the British are there to try and get trade concessions to open up ports to trade. This meeting between this Lord Macartney and the emperor hinges on the visitor having to kowtow, having to go down on the ground, hit their head on the ground 3 times, then you stand up, you go back down, you kneel, knock, knock, knock again, you stand up, you go back down, a total of 9 knocks off the head on the ground. But the British were not going to have any of that. That's not dignified. But the myth is that if they had done that, things would have been different. And the myth is that this meeting shows an arrogant Britain, or on the other side, a very arrogant China, or both. But, when you read my chapter, you realize that both sides were quite well-meaning and tried to find a compromise. And that, in fact, even if they had done the kowtow, nothing would have changed. The compromise was going down on a knee and then just bending forward 3 times, But that myth is interesting because that's a particular time when we see a huge shift in opinions about China from Europe, before very positive and then negative. And that's when the Great Wall comes into our mythology as this great 2,000-year-old wall from that trip. While they were waiting for the negotiations over the kowtow, they went and explored the wall.
So another one of your hats is as part of Camphor Press Publishing, and you publish books on Asia, including Taiwan, Japan, China, etc. So could you tell us a little bit about how you got into starting that and what you're trying to accomplish with Camphor Press?
Well, it goes back to Formosa Odyssey, which I self-published in 2002. Couldn't find a publisher for it, which is different from my first book on Burma. I just sent that off to the first publisher. Said, yeah, we'll publish it. Oh, that's good. Oh, this publishing business is easy. Writing business is easy, isn't it? So no. So I had this book, Formosa Odyssey, and years later, a Taiwan-based Englishman named Michael Cannings came to me. And he said, how about I do an ebook of Formosa Odyssey? It's a pity it's not available. And I'd sort of been waiting for someone with the technical skills to contact me. And I said, well, let's not just do that. How about this? And how about that? And, a few hours later over beer, we decided to put out a publishing house. Well, to found a publishing house a year later with a third person, an editor called Mark Swafford. We, lucky 3, started Camphor Press, February 2014, focused primarily on Taiwan, but also China and Japan, Korea. Our goal was to publish intelligent, interesting books, something we'd want to read ourselves, and would not only read, but read to the end. There is a huge gap in the market. On one side, you have all this sort of self-published, some of it's okay, but there's a lot of low-grade stuff, or stuff that could be better. And on the other side, you have an absolute tidal wave of academic publications. These are basically just rehashed PhDs, and there's not much thought given to the reader. So in between, intelligent, readable books with people knowledgeable about the area, we thought, wow, Yes. And also, a lot of our books are reprints. It's an absolute tragedy that you have these magnificent books out of print. Wow. Even like Tea House of the August Moon. How could that be out of print?
I know, it's amazing. And that's is one of the great things about ebooks is that, we can, if someone's willing to do it, such as Camphor Press, bring a lot of these things back into readership, and they deserve it so much.
Yeah, so we also do paperbacks, hardbacks. But yeah, I'm a big ebook reader and recommend people getting a Kindle or some other device. Yeah, no distracting things on them. You can read.
Okay, now I'm going to interrupt here for a moment because I'm a huge fan of Camphor Press and I love to read. And I went through my shelves, ebook and print, and I have 20 books published by Camphor Press. And however, I've only read 13 of them so far. So I'm still working through them. I even kind of thought, gosh, maybe I should make it my goal for one year to read every title of Camphor Presses. It'd be so much fun. But I'm just going to rattle off the ones I have read because I think it can give our listeners a good idea of what types of things you publish. Most recently, I'm just halfway through Up to the Mountains, Down to the Country. I'm not going to tell all the authors because it'll take too much time. So sorry about that to my precious, dear authors. A Korean Odyssey, An American Bum in China, Inaka Anthology, and that one's about Japan. Migrante, a wonderfully written book about a Philippine immigrant to Taiwan who works on a fishing boat. Rabbit Moon, about China. Same Moon, about Japan. Star-Crossed, that was Madame Butterfly. The Okinawa We Lost. Tea House of the August Moon, about Japan. And like you said, that is such a classic. I absolutely love that book. A Pail of Oysters, another classic on Taiwan. Formosa Odyssey, and You Don't Know China, and Taiwan in 100 Books. All three of those by you and must-reads.
Not a bad list. And you didn't include our Nobel Literature winning books. Yeah, we've got Pearl S. Buck's
Pearl S. Buck.
biographies. Now, Pearl S. Buck, The Good Earth, 1931. Now, it's a huge, huge book. But when she got the Nobel Prize in Literature, I think it was 38, they specifically mentioned her two biographies as masterpieces. The Exile, that's on her mother, and Fighting Angel, on her father. Incredible writing. Wow. So we picked up a huge number of books from another publisher called Eastbridge, and that really boosted Camphor Press into the big league. And, we've got about 120 books now.
Great. And you do a lot of travelogues because Formosa Odyssey was a travelogue, right? And a lot of these others on my list, anyway, that I've read are also travelogues, such as the one on South Korea, A Korean Odyssey.
Beautiful book.
Yep, that was very nicely written. He was a journalist, wasn't he?
Michael Gibb, yeah.
So what are your feelings on the travelogue as a genre? How has it changed, and what do you think we have in store?
Well, I'm too angry to think straight. I think it's absolutely outrageous that the travelogue's such a neglected, such a dead genre. I mean, it's a magnificent, magnificent framework for a book. You have a journey, you have a description of these exotic places, and then it's such wonderful scaffolding for information about the culture, the history. I love them. Always loved them since I was very young. So, yeah, sad to see it so neglected. Oh, my Lord, when you're looking at books from the 1950s, something like 7 Years in Tibet by Heinrich Harrer, that's published in 1951. But you might be looking at a printing from 53, and it's got like third printing of the year, and in the front matter. Just enormous numbers of books for these travelogues, all the way through to the 90s, really. And then the internet came and killed everything.
And why is that?
Well, people became more self-obsessed. They don't need to read other people's more informed takes on things, and maybe they're just busy watching cat videos.
Probably. Well, there's some great ones on Japan. Hokkaido Highway Blues was really great. It's also had another title, Hitchhiking with Buddhas by Will Ferguson. And of course, one of my all-time favorite travel writers was Thoreau, but I don't think he ever came to Japan, did he?
That's right. So Thoreau is an example of someone who did better before the arrival of the internet.
Of course, for American readers, Bill Bryson, even Ernest Hemingway. I mean, that's really why his stuff was so popular. He was doing things that people could only dream of doing and never actually do them themselves, right? Mm-hmm. Going to Spain and watching bullfights and telling about all that culture were things that people were listening to for the first time.
I think Chandler, it would be my most modern pop.
Yeah, you read a lot of modern stuff because you get submissions in. So how does the submission process work at Camphor? Because are you the person that people send manuscripts to?
Yep, that's me. We need 3 green lights from the 3 people behind Camphor Press. I'm the first green light, yes.
So you read a lot of stuff.
Yes, they were currently closed to submissions because, we're behind schedule. For reasons of professional etiquette, I can't share some of the crazy stuff that lands in our inbox, but you can imagine. But I can tell you a few things. I've been surprised by how good other publishers are, small publishers. Peter Goodman, for example, very friendly with us. He's always willing to lend a helping hand. Mm-hmm. Earnshaw Books and Blacksmith Books. The little publishers, they are fellow sufferers, fellow toilers in the fields. And I guess the other surprise is just how bad the big publishers are. Horrendous. They're evil. They don't have any love of books. Shocking, We're trying to sometimes track down the rights for these wonderful out-of-print books, and there's no money in it for us. It's just because the book deserves another life, but they just ignore you.
Oh, really?
Or they say, well, they give you some sort of, we'll look into it, we'll pass that on. But no, basically they have no interest in helping you out. Just a simple letter saying, we no longer have any rights to the book. No, right. Very bad, very disappointing.
That is, sure. Okay. And what are your favorite travel books when you talk about the classics and such? What are your favorite ones?
Okay, 7 Years in Tibet, magnificent. Another one people probably haven't heard of is Land of Jade, a journey from India through northern Burma to China. That's from 1996, but a Swedish journalist traveled through northern Burma, but it's just a fantastic tale. It's like going back to an earlier age, these areas which had been shut off from the outside world since the 1940s and really little explored or known before that. Just the complete lack of artifice. Actually, we have a book in the footsteps of Genghis Khan. By John de Francis. Now, that describes his travels in northern China, northwest China in the 1930s. 93. That's the same year Tim Severin put out In the Footsteps of Genghis Khan. Some people think it's a very tired formula, but for someone who's still working on In Search of the Mongolian Man-Beast, I'm drawn to searches, and I'm drawn to In the Footsteps of.
Yes. Right. Okay, and now at the end of the podcast, we always like to ask our guests what their favorite 3 books are on Japan. I mean, it could be Asia too, but I feel like we've discussed a lot of books on Asia in general anyway. So I am very interested in knowing what your 3 favorite books on Japan are.
Okay, so in chronological order, it would be On the Narrow Road to the Deep North, Journey into a Lost Japan. Yeah, Leslie Downer. So that's an example of this sort of In the Footsteps, wonderful combination of modern description.
I really liked that book too. I was surprised that more people haven't read it.
Second book, again, it's travel and history. And someone who's been on your podcast, John Dougal's In Search of Japan's Hidden Christians.
Yes, that book really makes me want to go to Nagasaki. I haven't yet been to Nagasaki, but we're planning a trip. Hopefully it'll come sooner.
And the third one, well, I should give a plug to an upcoming Camphor Press book next month, I think. Chirinko by Tom Gibb. It's a cycling travelogue through Japan. I think perhaps the future of the travelogue is actually not traveling that much, but just a long immersion in a place. The Widow, the Priest, and the Octopus Hunter. That's my third.
Oh, my book.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's very nice of you. It's a good point, though. I've often thought the same thing, if that might be the next step in travelogues, because now that everyone can, write a blog and Instagram about places they've gone, what about digging down to the nitty-gritty about living in a place? And I even noticed that traveling has changed a lot since social media. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I noticed was I used to also do a podcast on Japan with a friend of mine, and people would contact us and say, "Oh, I'm coming to Japan and I want to meet you." So that was the first step. And that was at least 10 years ago, of people having contacts there already. They felt that they knew someone that they could then meet. And then their whole itinerary is based around these people in different places that they've made contact with to, have a cup of coffee with them. And I really saw that as a trend in a changing away from just doing the regular tourist beat stuff. And of course, since I live on an island, it's another way for people to come out and see a place that they wouldn't get to see otherwise if they didn't know someone who would help them get there and see the things.
Absolutely. So the earlier travelogue, aspirational, people would have liked to travel themselves. Today, yes, the equivalent is, I'd like to stay in this place for a time. I'd like to live here for a year. Especially on an island.
Absolutely. And I noticed also that Alex Kerr's latest book called Hidden Japan, that book is an armchair traveler's, guide to Japan. And he uncovers places that people haven't been to and stuff. But he says at the beginning of the book, please don't go to these places. Right? I want to tell you about them, but if you go, then you'll ruin it, right? Because it'll just, all these tourists will go. So I thought, well, that's an interesting idea on a travelogue, isn't it? So it's interesting to see, how much the genre is changing and still perhaps creating a need for that.
Well, yes. One of my favorite fictional detectives is Rex Stout's Nero Wolfe, and he loves to drink beer and just stay in his house, and he solves mysteries from there.
Hey, I like it. Well, anything you can do with a beer in your hand has got to be good. Well, thanks so much for joining us, John. I feel like I could talk to you for hours. Thank you for your thoughts on things, and I hope to have you on the podcast again sometime, yeah?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I'd love to.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Amy Chavez and Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. The Books on Asia podcast is sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publishing quality books on Asia for over 30 years. You can find their books at www.stonebridge.com. And while you're there, check out The Forgotten Japanese, Encounters with Rural Life and Folklore by Miyamoto Tsuneichi, translated by Jeffrey Irish. This is a collection of photos, vignettes, and life stories from pre- and post-war rural Japan, looking at country lives and lifestyles that have all but disappeared today. And I'm your podcast host, Amy Chavez, author of Amy's Guide to Best Behavior in Japan and The Widow, the Priest, and the Octopus Hunter, Discovering a Lost Way of Life on a Secluded Japanese Island. See you next time.